Good afternoon, and thanks for joining our call on value acceptance and the impact on residential real estate appraisal. My name is Bill Garber, and I'm the Director of Government and External Relations for the Appraisal Institute. Thank you for joining today. We are going to take questions from our audience at the end. All participants can ask questions via the questions tab, which you can see on the right-hand side of your dialog box. We are scheduled for 60 minutes today. We're going to try to be respectful to everyone's time. And this call is being recorded. It will be made available off of the Appraisal Institute's YouTube page within 1 day of today's event on March 28th, 2023. With that, I'd like to welcome the 2023 President of the Appraisal Institute, Craig Steinle.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you to all the attendees for taking time to join us in the second of these series of very important meetings this year. I want to introduce our presenter to you. I also have an opening comment or two after doing so. Lyle Radke is the Senior Director of the Single Family Collateral Risk Division at Fannie Mae. There's a slide coming up here with his image and some more information about Lyle. And as I turn to Lyle and hand this off to him, I want to tell you, Lyle, that since I've been an officer, I have not received more calls than I have on this one in terms of emails and personal reach outs. This particular issue has raised a lot of questions and concerns among our members, and I'm so pleased that you've decided to join us today to talk about some of those. We've had some big issues come before us, and yet this one seems to have generated the most interest, at least to me personally, in these 3 years as an officer. When the announcement was made by Fannie, we offered two concerns in writing. One was this particular timing with a little more volatility in the market, to be looking at what's happening on the collateral side with this change by Fannie. And the other concern is you've been a very valued partner of ours with the Appraiser Diversity Initiative, and we're really worried about what this might do to the opportunities for those new individuals who are looking forward to working in our profession with this shift in policy by Fannie. And again, we put that in writing. That's out there. You know, those are our concerns. So I want to just give you that background because it's an important topic. I think, Lyle, you've got about 10 minutes. You wanted to talk to us about a few things before we opened it to some of the questions from the panelists. So, Lyle?
Yes, thank you, Craig, and thank you, Bill, for inviting me today. Let's see, I'm going to attempt to show my screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see something now.
Yeah, that looks good, Lyle.
Okay. Yeah, and so what I wanted to do just to begin with is kind of level set on what was the policy change that we announced on March 1st, and then give a little bit of color about what that means. So I got to start with our legal disclaimer, and here it is. And basically, it says that no matter what I say, the selling guide is our official statement of policy. So I'll try to be consistent with the selling guide, but in the event that you notice any discrepancies, you should rely on the selling guide. So in case you missed it, on March 1st, we announced 4 policy changes. The first is that we changed the name of our appraisal waiver to value acceptance. And just to get right into the thick of things here, Craig, I think this might be the one that's created the most anxiety. We included an explanatory comment that this was to attempt to avoid confusion about what an appraisal waiver is. And it may have sounded like we're only going to do appraisal waivers, but that's not true. The essence of this is just a name change, no change in the program. And we've offered appraisal waivers for about 25 years, and so this is nothing new. The second change we're calling value acceptance plus property data. Now you can kind of see how those two dovetail, right? We wanted to get the naming right so that it conveys exactly what we're doing, you know, a name that represents the actual process. And in this case, what value acceptance plus property data is very similar to what we used to call an appraisal waiver, except that we are going to obtain property data with that. And if you wanted to sort of conceptualize that, you could think back to the 2075 form that we had in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This is very similar, only it's digital, and it includes an interior inspection rather than drive-by or exterior only. The third thing is we did mention hybrid appraisals, and I'll get into some more detail about that. But the important thing for the audience to know is that this is not a broad launch of a hybrid appraisal program. And the fourth policy change is some new flexibilities or options in the 1004D process. So how does this fit into our strategy? I think we could go back to maybe 2018, and our conservator, the FHFA, included a scorecard goal for the GSEs, both GSEs, to explore various opportunities to modernize how we manage collateral risk. And so we've been on a journey since then, and actually beginning well before that, because if you think about it, UAD, UCDP, those are also part of that journey. But we've been specifically examining various new technologies and new processes in pilot programs. And from that exploration, we have settled on a kind of a spectrum here, which is represented on this slide, of different ways to manage our collateral risk. And some of these are things that you're very familiar with, right? The traditional appraisal, probably everybody on this call is very familiar with that. The desktop appraisal is something we launched about a year ago in the selling guide, but it has a long history as well, right? That was something we used in the COVID pandemic when we needed some, flexibility around social distancing. And it's something that in concept has been used in the appraisal profession for a long time. I mean, there were desktop appraisals when I was in the field more than 20 years ago. So it's nothing new, but what we've tried to do is standardize it, make sure that we're not sacrificing too much in terms of risk management in order to obtain the flexibility. The hybrid appraisal, then, I'll get to that a little bit more on the next slide, but this is really not a launch of the hybrid appraisal. But what a hybrid appraisal is, it's a combination of a desktop and a property data collection, to put it simply. And we are studying that in pilot. Then on the far left, value acceptance, right? Again, situation where we can, for certain low risk loans, originate the loan without obtaining an appraisal, something that we have done for more than 20 years with good results in terms of, we've been able to measure loan quality, loan performance of loans with appraisal waivers through the Great Recession. They performed very well. They outperformed loans with appraisals. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just because they're better than appraisals, but I think the GSEs deploy them very responsibly, and we deployed them with great success. We continue to monitor the loan performance on loans with appraisal waivers very carefully, and we continue to see that they do perform very strongly. So this idea of property data collection is something we've been testing in pilot for about 7 years, and it's gone through some iterative improvements over that time. We've learned some learned some things through our pilot experience. So we felt like it was mature enough that we wanted to make that offering available to all of our customers rather than a select few. And the timing of it is really coincidental. It happened to come to maturity at the same time that the Federal Reserve decided to raise interest rates. Those are two completely independent items. But the property data collection itself is really an enhancement in the risk management category. So one of the questions we asked ourselves is, of all the loans where we currently offer appraisal waivers, is there a segment of those where we would rather get property data than just offer a pure waiver? And the answer is yes, and there's a lot of scenarios where that would be helpful. So part of what we're doing with value acceptance plus property data is we're carving off some of the scenarios where we previously would have gotten appraisal waiver, and we're going to get property data instead. But there are also some situations where previously we would have gotten an appraisal because of a certain lack of, the only thing lacking in our analytics was recent property observation. And so in that case, we could use the property data as a very targeted response to a narrow risk concern. And so there will be some situations where we previously would have gotten an appraisal, but in the future we'll get a property data collection. So we're taking a little bit from appraisal waiver, a little bit from appraisal, and that's what's flowing into this new bucket. All right, I'll try and hustle through this. What is property data collection? Property data collection is something where we have prescribed a data standard that we require to be completed. It tells the property data collector exactly what data elements we need, exactly what enumerations are available for those data elements, exactly what photographs are needed, exhibits are needed, and that's required to be submitted to us through a web portal, an API, and that process is very prescribed. We were aware that for a long time, really for a couple of decades, in the home equity space and other lending regimes, the hybrid appraisals have been an option, and the property data collection processes were really unstandardized. If we were going to consider that for our usage, we wanted to make sure that we didn't have any gaps. So we really did a good job of getting a thorough description of the property. So that's what we've been working on in pilot for the last 7 years. And all of this is published on our website, so you can look it up and see what's in the standard if you're curious about that. So one point that I think is really important is that appraisers can do property data collection. They have a skill set that's very applicable to that process. There's nothing in our policy that would prohibit them from doing it. It's very similar to what an appraiser does today. It's maybe just a little bit more standardized and a little bit more technology driven in terms of the on-site data collection. So there is a lot of tech involved, and I've gotten asked the question, well, can an appraiser just sign up and do this? Well, you really need to integrate with our technology. That's a lift that most appraisers, I know when I was in the field, I wouldn't have had the ability to build a connection to an API or any of the other technology. And I really, quite honestly, wouldn't have wanted to. It's outside of my skill set, it's outside of my focus. It wouldn't have been good use of my time. So you're gonna have to partner with a technology provider. And we have published a list of the current technology providers, but there are probably more. Well, I know there are more that are working on developing that technology. So one of the potential benefits for appraisers is that if you just love field work, you can, with this, you can potentially specialize in field work. All right, so let's just talk about hybrid appraisals for a minute. We are offering the value acceptance through Desktop Underwriter. We also offer, at a loan level, we also offer the desktop appraisal through Desktop Underwriter. And what that means, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, Desktop Underwriter is our automated underwriting system, and it communicates with lenders. Lenders enter a loan application into the system, and the system then tells them what documents and due diligence is required in order to originate that loan in a compliant way for Fannie Mae. So there are collateral messages in Desktop Underwriter. It will tell the lender what the minimum collateral requirement is. And in the case of the hybrid appraisal, there's no message. Like, they're not allowed to do hybrid appraisals per Desktop Underwriter. However, in our selling guide, we have defined one exception, which is what you see on the screen. So if they start down this road of getting a property data collection for value acceptance, and then let's say the borrower comes in and says, you know what, I was going to put 20% down, but I changed my mind, I'm only going to put 10% down. And maybe that property data collection is already done and paid for. The question is, you're no longer eligible for VA plus PD. What do you do with that PD? And the answer is, we will allow the lender in that situation to get a hybrid appraisal. So you may see a few hybrid appraisals shake out of this, but we expect that'll be pretty infrequent. All right, last slide for me. We've been following the news media on this, and there are some misconceptions. So I thought it'd be good to just talk about some of those misconceptions. First one we've talked about already. This is not a change in strategy. This is not an abandonment of the appraisal process. This is just a rebranding. Okay, just renamed our appraisal waiver to make the name better fit the process. Because when we execute an appraisal waiver, we're doing a lot of due diligence within our systems. And it's all anchored around, in fact, it's anchored onto a prior appraisal observation. We don't offer appraisal waivers unless we have a prior observation of the subject property in our appraisal database. Okay, so that's a prerequisite. There's always a prior appraisal before you get to the point of considering whether or not you could offer a waiver. Second one, are we retiring appraisals altogether? No, absolutely not. Most loans will continue to get appraisals. In fact, most appraisers will probably not notice any change or very little change in their volume based on this option. Third, believe that appraisers are not allowed to perform property data collection. Not true. Appraisers certainly can, and we'd encourage it. We think they're a great fit for that. There have been some questions about our published list of providers. So I think the key here is that list is open. It's not closed, and it'll continue to grow over time. Then we talked about hybrid appraisals. This is not a broad launch. And then another question is about how are property data collectors trained? And the answer to that, the simple answer is lenders are accountable to us for the quality of the property data. So they have to get it right, or they face potential repurchase and other consequences, right? So there is some flexibility on the lender side as to how they train property data collectors, and I think some of that depends on who they choose to partner with. For example, we have one company in the pilot who their core competency, their business model is providing inspection services for insurance claims. Now, if you think about it, in order to process an insurance claim, the insurance company is at high risk of fraud. That's a really tough business to be in terms of, you're just writing a check to somebody who you don't know who or what for, other than they told you their house was damaged. So the inspector is really a key part of the fraud control. Those people are well trained and very, very knowledgeable about home construction, and so we thought they'd be a great fit, right? What kind of training does that insurance inspector need? They need to learn how to use the app, and I would say that the same is probably true for many appraisers. Although I will say, as an appraiser, first 15 years that I was in the business, I got very little training on property inspection. The training tended to focus on valuation methodologies. So, but I think most appraisers do learn it over time, and I think they have a good skill set for that. So here's some resources. I'll just leave those up there for a minute, but back to you, Craig and Bill, and happy to take any questions.
Wow, thanks very much for that summation. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and take the screen back and introduce and welcome our panelists. Joining Craig and I are Alan Gardner, MAI SRA, who's the Region 8 Vice Chair of the Appraisal Institute, Tina Mindeman, SRA AIRRS, Region 2 Vice Chair, Justin Slack, MAI SRA AIGRS and AIRRS, our Government Relations Committee Chair, and Mark Perrett, SRA Region 8 Chair of the Appraisal Institute. So welcome to our panelists today. Appreciate your time and resources and expertise in this space. We want to open up some discussion and give a couple of questions to each to start, to open it up. Let's go ahead and start with Alan Gardner. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Lyle, and appreciate that presentation. There was we're probably going to have to change our questions up because you answered some things there, and I appreciate the detail on that. It was good. So my first question kind of starts with what you ended with on the property data collection. There is some concern about that, and I mean, if you do a quick search, you can see on Glassdoor and Indeed kind of what they're being paid, and you also see some reviews of this, of this job by people that have had it. And I guess my question kind of comes around to the fact that, so the lenders in the property data fact sheet you give the lenders, like you had said, the lender's responsible for the accuracy to get rep and warrant on for the property data. Can you expand a little bit on how the lender is supposed to research that, especially if it's these large companies that are doing it? What is their responsibility? How far do they go to make sure that property data delivers a safe, sound, and structurally home?
Yeah, the lender has, our selling guide prescribes pre-funding QC and post-acquisition QC requirements for lenders, and those requirements apply to all aspects of the loan origination, including the credit and including the appraisal, and in this case also including the property data collection. So they need to do a sample that's prescribed by our selling guide. We expect them to validate, but not necessarily recreate. So they're going to look at the information in the property data collection. They're going to cross-check that against photos. They're going to cross-check that against the floor plan. They'll cross-check that against any other data sources that they have handy, such as public records or prior appraisals, MLS, whatever information they have available. And part of it is just a reasonableness test, right? But part of it is if you find something that doesn't match, then you got to sort that out. Now, we do the same thing once we receive the loan. Of course, we don't have the manpower to look at every loan, so we have sampling strategies, but we also review a robust selection of files with the property data collection in our post-acquisition review process, the same as we do for appraisals. And we hold the two to essentially the same standard. Like the way that we judge appraisals on how they describe the subject is the same way we judge the property data collection on how they describe the subject.
Okay, thank you for that. So one additional question, then I'll pass it on. So let's say that the lender may not be comfortable with the PDRs they're getting, or let's say that the borrower or buyer wants a full traditional appraisal. Can you explain, does a lender lose any rep and warrants if they don't take the value acceptance, or do they lose any benefits? In other words, can a borrower say, hey, I want a full appraisal for whatever reason that he or she may have?
Yeah, the DU message defines the minimum requirement. So they can always go beyond the minimum, which in this case would mean if they wanted to upgrade to a traditional appraisal, they could. That's absolutely allowed. In terms of the impact, that depends on the quality of the appraisal, right? So if the appraisal is well done and it gets a low risk score, then they get the same rep and warrant relief they would have gotten with the property data collection. But they do have an additional risk in terms of the value on the appraisal. And if that value is not well supported, then they could face some risk exposure in that regard.
Thank you for that.
Mark Perrett.
I almost started talking without the mute button. Lyle, thank you for coming. Nice to see you, and appreciate you talking about this. President Steinle touched on, I think, a really important issue surrounding this release in the concern for appraisers. And it sounds like it was just coincidental in the release, but it just comes at a time that that appraisers are already concerned on a number of fronts about the need for their services from the mortgage industry generally. And so, I think there's just a lot of concern generally about any changes going forward in that one way or another. So I appreciate you coming and talking about these topics. I think first, just kind of a simple procedural question is, if a company or an appraiser does a PDR, are they then ineligible to do, or if this turns into an appraisal, and I guess this is in that hybrid scenario where the loan details change, does it preclude them from doing the back end of that assignment?
No, absolutely not. If it converts into a hybrid appraisal, then the same person who did the property data collection, assuming they're an appraiser, could be asked to do the hybrid. We would treat those as two separate assignments. So I think the trick is for the appraiser, they would want to disclose the property data collection as a previous service.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Great to know. Appraisal Institute is deep into and cares deeply about the Appraisal Diversity Initiative and bringing new appraisers into the marketplace. And there's a lot of concern just about possibly a dwindling need for appraisers going forward. And it would be helpful, you've touched on it a bit in these slides, as Alan said, you've done a good job covering some of the questions we had up front. But if you could spend a little bit of time talking about the appraiser's role over the next 5-10 years as you see it, as compared to the last decade or so.
Well, for those of you who are acquainted with Rachel Bean, who works with me at Fannie Mae, she is so passionate about the Appraiser Diversity Initiative, and so are we all. And we do. I think that this profession is going to be around a long time, probably well after I'm gone, right? And so we do need new young appraisers with skill sets that include this new world of technology and data that we're in. The world's really changed from when I got into business in terms of the proliferation of data and technology. And I'm just thinking about my kids. They're so much more comfortable in the virtual world and with technology. Sometimes I'll ask myself a question and I'm banging my head trying to figure out the answer, and my kids are like, "Just Google it, Dad." Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I always forget. So it's a different world, and I think it's really important that we bring new people into our profession that have this kinds of skill sets they'll need going into the future. That said, I will say something about the timing. Well, first, let me say, I would love it if the Appraisal Foundation would allow property data collection to count as professional experience for trainees. Currently, it's a little unclear whether that would count, but I certainly think it should count. I think it's applicable. I think it's a great activity for a new appraiser to be involved in. That said, the economy is cyclical. Interest rates are cyclical. If you've been in this business long enough, you will have seen multiple ups and downs. What we see with the interest rate cycle is that when interest rates are low, we typically have a refinance boom. And when interest rates are higher, then purchases tend to predominate. These alternatives to the appraisal, the value acceptance and the value acceptance plus property data are designed specifically that the highest hit rates will be in the refinance. So remember what I said originally, there has to be a prior appraisal observation before we can issue a value acceptance. And in what scenarios are you most likely to have a recent prior appraisal? Well, when you bought the house a few years ago and now you want to refinance it, right? So what we saw is very high rates during the refinance boom in 2021, but today those rates are much, much lower than they were. And that's just an artifact of the interest rates. So in essence, it's kind of a buffer for the appraiser profession in terms of capacity. When things are really busy, appraisers are really busy, a big chunk of that's going to go to value acceptance because it's refinance work, particularly if it's rate term refinance and there's no new credit risk exposure to Fannie Mae. But in times like right now, when it's predominantly a purchase market and things are slower, the offer rates are a lot lower because there's just not so much refinance activity.
Wonderful, thank you. I've got one more closing question. I was really intrigued by the 7 years of experience with the property data collection process and product in pilots and in betas. I wonder if you could speak to it all. If I follow rational thought, you had a slide here that was suggesting that appraisers have the skill set and would be likely good property data collectors, and this could be a career for them or at least a niche business. I wonder, in your 7 years of experience with such more stringent licensing requirements, I would imagine that a dollar per hour expectation of appraiser would end up being quite a bit higher than someone that has, basically, let's say a few hours of training or whatever it is, days of training, but certainly significantly less than what an appraiser has. Do you have any data or any casual observations on how many PDRs appraisers were actually completing in those 7 years?
I don't have great data on that. One of the challenges of that, Mark, is that, of course, 2020, 2021, the beginning of 2022, appraisers were so busy with refinances that that was really a better economic use for them, and they, most appraisers were not really interested in doing property data collection at that point in time. Early on in the process, if you go back to 2017, 2018, the technology was not so good, the standard was not so mature, so I'm not sure that would be a great barometer either. So I think, we'll see. I think that one of the challenges with pricing, we don't prescribe pricing. There's some confusion about the various standards. So we have a standard, Freddie Mac has their own standard. They rolled out their program last July, it's been out there for 9 months. And there are other entities that do similar kinds of things for, let's say, home equity lending that are not compliant with the GSE standards. So I can't really speak to specific instances of fees and costs and scope of work because it's still a pretty varied landscape. But that said, I think as lenders start to learn the importance of data quality to us, and as they start to get some feedback from us on data quality, that will drive performance, right? You cannot you get what you pay for. If you hire the cheapest asset and they're not well trained and they don't do a great job, then that's going to impact the lender in terms of their relationship with Fannie Mae. One other thing I'll add, though, is that this process is tech heavy. There are some suppliers who have integrated their 3D scan technology with their property data collection technology, and that means that whoever's going to the property maybe isn't spending as much time there. They're not measuring the house in the way that an appraiser classically would have, and things, the technology drives you through the process very efficiently. So what an appraiser needs to think about in order to be competitive is how efficient can I get at property data collection? How can I line up several in a row so that I'm not driving a lot? Can I use the technology to really increase my speed at the property and increase the efficiency at which I gather the data? Those are questions which I think the market is still going to innovate, and we may still see some evolution. We're still in kind of the beginning of this.
I think just to elaborate on part of Mark's earlier question about the trainee piece and the appraiser qualifications criteria for appraisers is that I believe that is this property data collection process is creditable experience for trainees, but it needs to be logged under a supervisory appraiser under the existing criteria. And what we see here is almost an alternative workforce that is resting below the trainee classification. The concern is that it's potentially pulling away work that could be completed by trainees under that supervisory appraiser trainee paradigm or that relationship. Moving forward, I mean, the foundation would have to come to grips with the idea of prior experience and then how that would be logged or counted in a process. And we have talked to them about that idea, but there's still a lot of questions about how that would be executed. I'm going to go ahead and turn to Tina now. Tina, you got a couple of questions.
I do. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Lyle, for joining us today. My first question kind of dovetails into Mark's comments. And first, why were only 6 companies approved with the recent announcement for property data collection? And second is, how can a small company like my firm seek approval to do property data collection?
The 6 companies were companies that participated with us in pilot, so they've got a little advanced notice of what our standard is and what our technology requirements are. But we, quite honestly, we have invited several dozen companies to participate or to build this, and they're in various stages of building. Some companies just simply didn't want to do it. They didn't feel like it was a good economic opportunity for them. And that's okay. We just, make it available as an option, but we're not going to twist anybody's arm to participate if they don't want to. Each of the companies that we worked with in pilot brought something unique to the table that we wanted to test. So I mentioned before this company that consists of insurance inspectors. Really interesting idea that we wanted to test is would they be a good fit for this kind of work? They have a really robust internal training program. That was something else we wanted to understand is how important was training and what sort of training options would there be? A couple of the other companies have, like I say, they've integrated their 3D scan technology with their property data collection technology. So that was a real interesting concept for us to test also. And so that kind of led to them being involved in the pilot. But some of it was self-selection, like companies that wanted to participate could, and companies that didn't want to didn't have to.
Okay, thank you. I have one other question, and you've touched on this a little bit, that it's just a coincidence that rates have shot up at the same time that you guys have come out with a value acceptance. So with that said, we have a lot of residential appraisers that are hurting financially right now. They're having a hard time finding work. So I wanted to give you just an opportunity. What comment would you like to make regarding the future of appraisers as a valued partner of Fannie Mae?
I think appraisers will continue to be a valued partner, and I will refer back to my earlier comments. As a appraiser myself, I went through several of these cycles of up and down. We all learned that when times are good, you've got to save, and when times are slow, you've got to manage your expenses, and that's the same for any business. It's a normal part of the business cycle.
Thank you, Lyle. Back to you, Bill.
Thank you both. And Justin, you got a couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lyle, for being here today with us. First, can you characterize the use of value acceptance in non-disclosure states or rural areas where data may be spotty or less reliable?
Part of the, I assume you're talking about the validation potential. And a part of that is just tied to the the technology itself and the exhibits. So we feel like this could be used successfully in non-disclosure states because it's not it doesn't violate anything in relation to disclosure of transactions, and certainly could be an interesting option in a rural area. It could save the appraiser a lot of driving if someone else was able to do that on-site inspection. So I do think that those are reasonable applications for the technology. But this is no different than what we have today. Appraisers who collect property data, appraisers who perform appraisals in rural areas or in non-disclosure states. How do we validate that the appraisal is accurate? We're going to do it the same way, exactly the same.
So do you, though, I guess, is there a different rate that you've seen or have been able to look at the data where this program isn't very good in a non-disclosure state, or not the PDR piece, but you have an appraisal, like you said, maybe from 2 years ago, and or I live in a rural area, so in rural areas, like it doesn't work very well because of the lack of data that's available, for the models. Is it?
Yeah. So we do test the contract price or the lender's estimate of value against our data set. And so in cases where the data is thin or where we don't have a clear read on the local market, then the offer rate would be lower, yes.
Okay, good, thank you. And then my next question is 2 parts, and so we have the purchase loan appraisal waiver rate has historically been about 10%. Do you anticipate that this might change in the short term or long term? Is the first part. And then the second part is, what do you envision happening to the makeup of the appraisal orders or requests between like interior, exterior only, or hybrid desktops into the future?
I think what we'll see in the short term is that the pure value acceptance rates will go down somewhat, and that will then be kind of taken up by the value acceptance plus property data. But if you add the two together, they'll be a little bit more than the current appraisal waiver rates or value acceptance rates, because again, we've looked at some of those low risk appraisal scenarios where the only thing we were really missing was a current observation on the property, and some of those will flow into the property data. So we're not targeting any specific offer rates. What we do is we establish standards. And so we say, here is, for this particular risk scenario, here's the minimum that we'll accept. And if market conditions or economic conditions or loan application pipelines manage to get inside of that box, then they're eligible. And if they don't get inside of that box, they're not eligible. And that's, we're not shifting the boundaries at all to try and capture any particular rate. We're looking at how to manage risk and then making options available on that basis.
Great, thank you very much. Bill, that's everything I had.
Okay, President Steinle, you had a question, I believe.
Thanks, Bill. I wanted to make sure I unmuted first. I've made that mistake many a time, as you're well aware, and you catch me every time. Lyle, I was intrigued by something you said about the training piece with regard to PDC individuals and those that produce a PDR. I want to avoid the danger here of us talking past each other where, we express concerns and you have answers for them. But it occurs to me that in the way that you describe sometimes PDR is outperforming appraisal inspections, is there any thought that Fannie might collaborate with some training for field appraisers? I think you also mentioned that as a field appraiser, that was one of the areas that was sort of learn as you go and not necessarily standardized. And I think that's a fair assessment of the industry right now, where we assume that everybody knows how to look at a house and make those observations. And you've obviously specialized now 120 data points and some of the other things on your slide. Any opportunity to collaborate there with some training to help better the workforce that is licensed and regulated and is held to higher ethical standards?
We actually created a training course with an education provider several years ago. That education provider, unfortunately, is now no longer in business. So that the core materials that we use still exist. It's not something that Fannie Mae typically does, like in the sense of developing continuing education. And part of the challenge there is you've got 55 different jurisdictions that you have to satisfy, and we don't necessarily have manpower to keep abreast of all of the approvals needed to drive a CE program, and it's really not our core competency. But yes, I think we have a lot of information that we could share, and certainly our standard is published, and we'll continue to publish more materials on this, and absolutely would love the opportunity to partner with an education provider and help develop materials that would address this part of the process.
Well, if I can follow up, Lyle, thank you for that answer. I find that enlightening as well. Number one, we're still in business, and number two, every course that we produce does have to go through that 55 jurisdiction acceptance problem that you just mentioned. So I think there is really an obligation almost for our organization and for you as a very large player in the mortgage market to help licensed professionals better understand some of the areas that you pointed to in past talks about deficiencies in data collection from the appraisal side. We're happy to help get that word out. So I'd offer that as a way to quit maybe speaking past each other and to work together in something that could be for the better good here.
Thank you, Craig. We'd love to have more conversations about that.
We're doing great on time here, and I really appreciate everyone's thoughts and perspectives. Let's go ahead and turn to some of the audience questions if we can. I'm going through it myself. While the kind of general sentiment is there's kind of a tone, there's several questions about the oversight process of the new property data collection as it relates to lender oversight. Can you maybe elaborate on the audit or oversight mechanisms that the GSEs or Fannie Mae might deploy as far as overseeing this release?
We have a team at Fannie Mae in our servicing area that looks at all of our servicing valuations. So if we've got a loan that's in default, then we have to look at potential workout solutions, and value is a key driver of those solutions, right? So if the value is less than the loan balance, then you're talking about taking a loss. And again, there unfortunately are people in our society who would take advantage of that situation, and fraud is always a concern there. So this team is very expert at analyzing property, and particularly very challenging properties, very difficult properties that we see in our short sale space or in our REO space, in our foreclosure space, and also assessing market and marketability and value. So we've managed to get some of their attention, and in fact, one group of that team, because foreclosures actually are very low right now, if you probably are aware of this, but our foreclosure rate and our default rate are extremely low. So this team has a fantastic skill set, but they aren't super taxed in terms of demand right now. And we've pulled them into this process. They look at a very robust sample of the property data that we receive from new vendors. And we've set up scorecards that those new vendors need to achieve certain milestones before they can go to full production. And that's a big part of our vetting process, right? Now, we also have, separate from that, our post-acquisition QC team. They're also expert in their own way on enforcement of our policies. And the same team that looks at all the appraisals is also looking at the property data collection, and they're looking at it through exactly the same lens. We don't necessarily disclose all our capabilities there, but let me just say that it is equal to what we deploy on the appraisal side.
Thanks, Lyle. Question here is, how recent does the prior appraisal have to be before an appraisal is, or a form of appraisal is considered?
Well, there's a few wrinkles to that. One wrinkle is, let's say that the location has gone through a major disaster, like a hurricane or a wildfire. Then the prior appraisal needs to be after the disaster. So if it's before the disaster, then we would exclude that. We would go get property data collection instead. We have published, or actually it wasn't us, but FHFA OIG published a paper on appraisal waivers several years ago, and that disclosed our age tolerance. The prior appraisal needs to be less than 6 years old. There are some other factors which we do, which I can't share.
Okay, appreciate that. I see kind of a general theme here from some participants' comments about that it's difficult because you're always going to have competition in the marketplace. There's always going to be pressure to compete and to try to reduce expenses all along the way. But at the same time, there's got to be some focus on quality and due diligence. And you know, what's your comment to that, Lyle? Here, that there's a kind of a general theme in some of the questions about a potential watering down effect on collateral risk. What would you say to people that share that?
Well, I'd say it's quite the opposite. Everybody who's at Fannie Mae today has joined since the Great Recession. The old management is long gone. I shouldn't say everybody. There are a few people around, but my team is a bunch of people who went through the Great Recession in the servicing space, and we observed all that pain and anguish, and we observed all that loss, and we observed that, you know, the human toll. We observed the bad appraisals that were part of that mix, right? And we are all extremely sensitive to risk management. The goal at Fannie Mae is to prevent ever having a meltdown like that again. You know, we've been in conservatorship for 15 years. We don't want to be in conservatorship, right? So our goal is, our first and foremost goal is good risk management. Now, what we've done is we've looked at data and analytics to determine how to best attract the best performing loans. And it turns out that if you offer an appraisal waiver, you have a higher probability that the lender will deliver that loan. So what we do is we look at the safest bucket of loans where we really think we'll get good return on our capital, and that's a factor in deciding whether or not to offer an appraisal waiver. And like I say, this strategy works. Those loans outperform loans with appraisals that have equal credit characteristics and equal LTV characteristics. So we're not sacrificing anything. In fact, quite the opposite. We are driving towards a stronger portfolio, and that's goal number one.
There's a lot of change here. There's change here, and then there's change that's forthcoming with the new UAD and forms redesign process as well that lies ahead. Do you have any concerns about losing existing appraisers to all of this sudden change or any of the transformation that lies ahead?
I'm glad you brought up the question of the new UAD. And I think that that's another example of that. If I were an appraiser, I would take comfort in the fact that the GSEs have just spent the last 5 years investing in a new appraisal data standard, right? We are obviously committing a lot of resources to appraisal for the long haul. So that should be comforting. Now, all the appraisers who are in the business today managed to get through the first UAD. The new UAD is going to be a little more tech driven. And it's building on the lessons that we've learned from the first UAD. So one of the things we learned from the first UAD is there was still a lot of data that ended up in the comments, and that was hard to consume, hard to find when you need it, right? So we're trying to design something that's a little bit more data centric, a little bit more specific in terms of the ask. And I think that that'll allow the the appraiser's software provider to build something that once you get used to it, I think it'll actually be easier to use, and it'll also be more consistent. And so I think, like anything new, there'll be a learning curve, but I feel like that's doable if you want to do it, if you want to be in this business, and that in the long run, I hope that appraisers will actually come to like it. I think it will solve some small, long-standing pain points around friction between our form and, let's say, USPAP, or between our form and other compliance requirements. And so we do see some upside opportunities for appraisers there.
Let me turn back to the panel. If there's any comments or questions about anything that's come in from the audience, please chime in or raise your hand. Tina, I see your hand.
I just have a question for Lyle real quick. You mentioned a couple of times that the waiver loans outperform the appraisal loans. And I'll be honest with you, my first thought was that that's your higher credit score borrowers. But I think you just said that that is still true even when the credit characteristics are the same. Did I understand you? And can you expand on that? How do you explain that?
It is true, and it has been consistent for decades. The way I explain it is this. We have a very conservative value threshold. When a borrower comes in with a low or conservative expectation for their own home's value, it says something about their mindset. And it turns out that same borrower, this is my own personal opinion, right? We haven't published anything on this. I can't point to anything definitive on this, but this is my working theory, is that those borrowers who qualify for appraisal waivers are the same ones who are basically, careful money managers, careful personal managers, risk averse, and that they will tend to perform well on any obligation.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, and Alan, you had your hand raised.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, so well, help me. I'll go back to your Google reference earlier, right? When you Google, sometimes you get great information, and sometimes you get bad information. So I'm fully aware of that. But if you Google right now the property data collectors, and I think this is where a lot of the fear is being coming from. You see a lot of stories about minimal training, like 3 hours training. You see stories about lower paid, which I'm not real sure that appraisers would take that trade off on the pay, and there's just a concern about quality. Obviously, and Fannie Mae's obviously y'all have done a ton of research in this. Help explain where your comfort level is. Do you think that data is just, you're going to be able to get the right data, enough data to go ahead and maybe have, or is it wrong? Is that everything you see on Google out there, is that wrong? Is it a much more stringent process that we're not aware of?
Alan, I think there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing I would say is that in our UCDP database, we have millions of properties that have had multiple appraisals. And so we're able to compare how the first appraiser described the property to how the second appraiser described the property. Now, of course, properties can change over time, so you have to kind of factor that and analyze that as well. But when we look at comparing, let's say, property data collection against a prior appraisal, the variance, the distribution, is exactly the same as when you compare an appraisal against a prior appraisal. So I think that tells you that the uncertainty in the property description is about equal for both processes.
Any other questions from our panel? There was one other question I saw, Lyle, and maybe we close on this one. Why was the name traditional appraisal used, as it implies old or dated or irrelevant? Why not suggest that a full appraisal is most reliable report, providing a more credible report?
Well, because it's not a full appraisal. So first of all, in terms of the approaches to value, most of the appraisals that we get on the URAR don't do a cost approach, don't do an income approach. We don't require those. Second of all, there's very little invasive testing. Appraisers make a lot of assumptions about what's inside the walls or under the foundation, right? They're looking for clues as to whether or not there might be a defect, but they're not doing any real rigorous testing about whether or not there is a defect. Every appraisal is loaded with all kinds of limiting conditions and opt-outs, right? So you can't call that a full appraisal. It's not full. You could do a lot more if you wanted to. Now that would be very expensive. I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I'm just saying in terms of terminology, how can you call that a full appraisal? I could envision a much more robust scope of work than what we get for the URAR.
But I guess maybe take that by extension. When the new UAD and the forms redesign completes its work, what would the full scope of service request, how would you refer to that, or what would you refer to that as?
Well, the new UAD will stand up a data standard and a template for delivering the report, but it doesn't define the scope of work. So it will accommodate various scopes of work. And I think each scope of work should be referred to, I mean, we're kind of overgeneralizing, right? But if you could group scope of work into sort of buckets, then I'm open to suggestion as to what you want to call them. I'm not sure that any of them would meet my definition of full.
Right. I think what was being implied in the question from the attendee was maybe traditional. Maybe we would think traditional as well.
Yeah, traditional is probably a good candidate. Traditional has been, I would say it this way. When I started in this business, which I hate to confess has been almost 30 years, the way that a URAR was performed has not changed much in 30 years. And my understanding from the old guys is that the basic form that we use for reporting, at least at the GSEs, has really not changed much in about 50 years. If that's not tradition, I don't know what is.
Appreciate that comment, Lyle. We are at time, everyone. I would really like to thank Lyle Radke for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your insights and your willingness to engage in the discussion on the new release. And I'd really like to thank our panelists for their insights and their commentary as well. Lyle, we won't say that this is the start of the conversation. Let's continue the conversation. And we look forward to working with you and seeing you on the term.
Again, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everybody on the panel. Appreciate the opportunity to come and converse today, and I hope that we were able to provide some helpful information. Happy to have follow-up conversations, and look forward to next time.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon.